Okay, so we're going to wrap up time period 5 today with the end of the Civil War unit. So we've started with the lead up to the Civil War in the 1850s. Then we talked about the war itself. And then now we're going to get into Reconstruction. So the war has ended, and now we've got a bunch of problems that we've got to sort out and figure out how to resolve those, bring the states back together, how to handle race relations at the time, and then also look at the political changes. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so you should be seeing now the my screen with chapter 14. So let's go ahead and look at the dates, because Reconstruction has a definite beginning and it has a definite end. So with Reconstruction, it starts with the end of the Civil War, certainly with the end of the war with the surrender at Appomattox, where Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Confederate cause. So Reconstruction begins the moment that the war is over, but there's also going to be a definite endpoint. 1877 is one of those dates that you need to know. There's not many dates in US history that are imperative that you know. This is one of them. So 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. We'll see how suddenly that comes to a halt, because you think about if you're rebuilding from a war, how do you know that that's actually over by a certain point? And that will happen here by the end of this chapter. Okay, so huge problems are going to exist. And how are we going to repair the Union? There has been so much division for so long. And now you've got the sacrifices that both sides have made over the war. Bringing the nation back together is not going to be very easy. So look at this cartoon where it says the rail splitter at work repairing the Union. The rail splitter was the nickname for Abraham Lincoln, kind of referencing back to, you know, his humble backgrounds. But then look at the other man here. So take it quietly, Uncle Abe, and I will draw it closer than ever. Okay, a few more stitches and the good old Union will be mended. So they're trying to repair all of the damage that's been done. And it's not going to be an easy task at all. So here are the questions that have got to be sorted out. First of all, how do you physically repair the South? Think about all the destruction that we looked at. Sherman's march through Georgia and South Carolina, all of the farming that's been neglected during the course of the war. And who's going to be responsible for paying for that? Who's going to provide the physical labor? You've got massive casualties and loss of life of men who would have been within the age range to perform this labor. What are you suddenly going to do with 4 million suddenly free people who had yesterday been enslaved? How is that going to work? Where are they going to find jobs? Where are they going to find housing? Where are they going to find land to farm? What's going to happen to all of these people? And then what are we going to do about these southern states? Think about all that's happened. Clearly, the South is to blame for this war, right? So if you're in the minds of the Northern congressional delegation, you want some sort of assurance that this isn't going to start again. Are they going to have to pay some sort of restitution for what has happened? Is there going to have to be some sort of punishment for Confederate leadership or military leadership from the South? How's that all going to be handled? Because think about this, if you were to punish Robert E. Lee, I mean, clearly Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, they've committed treason. Punishment for treason is death. What would happen in the South if the North arrested Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and executed them for their role in the Civil War? Is there going to continue to be peace, or is there going to be more violence? And then if you allow them to go unpunished, what is that saying? So there are no good answers to really any of these problems. And who is it who's responsible for sorting this out? Is it up to the president? Is it up to the Congress? What role will the southern states themselves play in negotiating a resolution to all of this? So this is what we mean by Reconstruction. Answering all of these questions is what will have to take place. So returning the states back to the Union, again, the question will be, will you punish those who were involved? Will they be charged with treason? Can you allow Southern senators and representatives who had been part of the Congress prior to the war? Are you going to allow them back into Congress to reclaim their seats? When the South begins to vote again for senators and members of the House of Representatives, are you going to allow them to elect Confederate leaders who had previously been part of this? In the state of Georgia, for example, Alexander Stephens, who is the vice president of the Confederation of States, the Confederacy, where Jefferson Davis was the president, Alexander Stephens from Georgia was the vice president. He was elected by the state of Georgia during this time period to go back and reclaim his seat for the state. Is that going to be allowed or not? And then again, who's going to make this decision, the president or the Congress themselves? So Lincoln, right before the surrender occurred, so the surrender happened in April of 1865, and they knew that the surrender was going to happen within a matter of weeks when Lincoln takes the second oath of office. So Lincoln's second inaugural, this is another document that we want to add in, another speech that Lincoln gives that's very critical in his understanding of how the situation is going to be handled. Okay, look at this quote. So this is another really important one. And I would write down this first phrase: with malice toward none, with charity for all. What's the word malice mean? Malice means like hatred or revenge. So with malice toward none, with charity for all. Charity is like help. So Lincoln is already establishing how he wants to approach Reconstruction. So if we're trying to debate this issue of should the South be punished or not, look at what Lincoln says right here before the actual surrender occurs: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to take care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. So Lincoln is signaling here very early on in the process that he's not out to punish the South. He wants to end the war. He wants to establish peace. He wants to come back together as quickly as possible and move on about the business of making the United States a strong nation, securing the economy, securing our affairs within the United States, working together again, that market revolution where all of the different regions are contributing to the success of the whole. That's what Lincoln is signaling. So once again, can we think about audience? Who's he talking to here? He's talking to the South. He's also talking, I believe, to members of his own party who are looking for revenge. They want some sort of somebody to pay for everything that has happened. So in many ways, I think he's talking to both the people of the South, signaling it's all going to be okay. We're going to come back together peacefully. But he's also sending a message to members of his Republican Party who want some sort of revenge. Malice toward none, charity for all. This is the route that Lincoln is wanting to take. I've also, I found the picture I was looking for last week where Lincoln is giving his second inaugural speech. Here is Lincoln, but look who's standing right up there. There's John Wilkes Booth, and all of these men right down here in very close proximity to the president are his co-conspirators. And within a month, actually a month and a half, they will have shot and killed Abraham Lincoln. So that's kind of interesting that they were right there in such close range of Lincoln. Okay, so Lincoln outlines his plan. He's now been safely reelected. He's taken the oath of office, and he lays out his plan for how he believes Reconstruction should happen. We're going to see that there are a number of different Reconstruction plans. So you want to make sure that you are clear on who has which plan and what the provisions are. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction has three different names. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction is first name. The Proclamation of Amnesty is its official name. What does amnesty mean? Amnesty is like forgiveness. So again, that signals the approach that Lincoln's going to take. And then it's also commonly referred to as the 10% plan, as you'll see why in just a second. So we could refer to Lincoln as a moderate. He's not wanting to punish the South harshly, but he's also not wanting to go back to the way things were prior to the Civil War and allowing the South to maintain slavery and all of that. So he's got, again, a more moderate approach. Look at the provisions. Once 10% of the voters who participated in the election of 1860 had sworn allegiance back to the government of the United States, then your state can re-enter the Union. Think about that. 10% of the voters who participated in the election of 1860. So we're going back to the time of the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, the number of voters who were eligible then. So this is not saying once you have added in the newly freed African Americans who were former slaves. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about from the number of voters that you had prior to the Civil War. Once 10% of those voters have sworn their allegiance back to the government of the United States, you can become a state once again with the full privileges of voting and participating in the Congress. 10% is not a lot, because remember, there were a lot of people by the end of the war in 1865 in the South who had become kind of disillusioned with the cause. So 10% is not a large number. Here's the second policy. Once that's happened, Southern states can then reorganize their new state government and apply for admission back to the Union. So again, he's saying we're not going to completely ignore everything that's happened. You've got to reapply, and Congress is going to look over how you've set up your state government. And one of the things that is an essential for them to allow you to come back in is to ratify the 13th Amendment, which frees the slaves. Okay, so there are going to be 3 amendments added to the Constitution during this period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. 3 constitutional amendments will be added. We will lump them together. We're going to group those amendments together and call them the Reconstruction Amendments. And you need to know 13, 14, and 15, and you need to know what they do. Here's the first one. The 13th Amendment ends slavery, okay? And the states have to ratify that as part of their new state constitution in order to reclaim their seats in Congress. And they can start that process once 10% of their voters have agreed to Reconstruction. All right, so that's the first plan. And we're going to call it a moderate approach. So again, not harsh punishment. How do you think many of the Republicans think of this? There's going to be some who are saying, we need to be a little tougher. This isn't really very, very strong reaction to the war. Those Republicans who would disagree with Lincoln's plan as being way too lenient are going to be known as the radical Republicans. Radical meaning extreme. These are the extreme Republicans who are saying, absolutely, the South has got to be punished. Lincoln's plan is giving them too much leniency. So look at the 2 leaders here, the main radical Republicans, Thaddeus Stevens, who's from Pennsylvania, and then Charles Sumner. Do you remember Charles Sumner? He was part of our story early on, prior to the Civil War. He was part of that bleeding Kansas situation. He was the Massachusetts senator who was almost beaten to death by the South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks. So Charles Sumner has now recovered from his brain injury, and he's coming back and he wants revenge. I think we can understand why. Think about, we're always talking about point of view. Think about Charles Sumner's point of view as a radical Republican. Why would he have this type of hatred for the South and want this level of punishment? Well, look what he's endured at the hands of the South. So they reject the 10% plan, and they adjust it and say that for the South to reclaim their seats, you have to have a majority, 50% plus 1 of the number of voters who had participated in 1860. 50% of those plus 1 have got to swear their loyalty back to the Union before we can even consider this. And then some of the other policies that will be required for their new state constitutions is no former soldiers will be allowed to be elected to a government position. So no former soldiers will be allowed to be office holders, okay? permanent disenfranchisement, which means permanent lack of voting, not just holding office, but lack of a right to vote of Confederate leaders. So that would be the generals, that would be the political leaders. So you're taking them out of the voting process and you're removing former soldiers as being eligible to serve in office. And they also demanded African-American equality, not just an end to slavery, but also equality. So that's going to be the other extreme, where Lincoln is somewhat in the middle. The radical Republicans are going to be on the extreme. When this reaches Lincoln's desk, because remember, and this is called the Wade-Davis bill. So the Wade-Davis bill is the radical Republican plan that has these provisions being maneuvered through the legislature by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. At this point, have the white Southern state office holders, have they resumed their position in the legislature? No, so they get this passed pretty easily through the Northern held Congress at the time. But for it to become law, Lincoln also has to sign it. And when Lincoln gets this, he uses the pocket veto. Now, way back when we first studied the writing of the Constitution, we said that how a bill becomes a law, the president has 4 choices of what to do with a bill that's been passed by Congress. The president can sign it into law. The president can veto the law. The president can do nothing with it. And if there's more than 10 days left in the session, it becomes a law without the president's signature. But if there's less than 10 days, that's called a pocket veto and the bill is killed. So that's why we went through all of that when we were studying the legislature or the Constitution, is because of this situation. So when Lincoln gets this particular bill, the radical Republican bill for Reconstruction's plan, Lincoln, there's less than 10 days left in the session. So rather than veto it, knowing that the radical Republicans had enough votes to override his veto, rather than veto it, he uses what's called the pocket veto, where he takes the bill, he folds it up, puts it in his pocket, never to be heard from again. So it's rejected, it's not accomplished, and we don't really have a plan moving forward because the radical Republicans are not on board with his proclamation of amnesty. So they're at a standstill over how to handle Reconstruction. And about that time, the surrender occurred in April of 1865. And then on April the 14th of April of 1865, within a week or so of the end of the war, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Completely shocks the nation. His assassin is this man, John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor, and he was performing in a play that Mary Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln had gone to see. The war's over. You know, they just want a night out to just kind of decompress. And they go to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. They're sitting in the presidential box up here, and Lincoln is going to be shot. And at the time that he's shot, John Wilkes Booth had kind of snuck in behind the curtain, shot Lincoln in the head, jumped off of the balcony, lands on the stage, and runs out the back. At the same time, now this is something that a lot of people overlook, that there was a larger plot to take out many of the Republican leadership within Lincoln's cabinet and administration. So there were co-conspirators who they had planned out that at the time that Lincoln was going to be killed at Ford's Theater, Edwin Stanton was going to be killed, William Seward was going to be killed, all of these people were going to be assassinated at the same time. So they had planned out who was going to go where. They tried to sneak into people's houses, and I believe it was either Seward or Stanton. I forget. I can't remember right now which one it was. But one of the conspirators did get into his house, disguised as like a delivery person, gets into the house and does try to kill that member of Lincoln's cabinet. So here they all are. They're ultimately captured, and they are all hung and executed. And notice that one of them was a woman, Mary Surratt. She used to travel between the different conspirators, and she would have messages between them that she would stitch in the hem of her skirt, down at the bottom of her skirt. And then once they were there, then she would deliver these messages. So she was part of the plot as well. Now, John Wilkes Booth went and hid in a barn and was injured. He'd broken his ankle in the jump off of the balcony. And after a while, massive manhunt is underway to capture him, and he is eventually captured, and he is also executed as well. All right, so here we have the new president of the United States, and this is a little interesting because when Lincoln, you'll remember when he was running for president the second time around, he was trying to signal this idea of unification with the South. And he chose as his vice president in the election of 1864, he chose the Democrat, Andrew Johnson. We talked about that earlier, where Andrew Johnson was chosen because he was a Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union. He didn't think that constitutionally the South had the authority to secede. He thought that it was a permanent compact between the states. So Andrew Johnson had been chosen as a white Southern Democrat to run with Abraham Lincoln, signaling this idea, again, malice toward none, charity for all. We're going to work together. We're going to bring the country back together, almost like this peace offering. Well, suddenly now Andrew Johnson is president of the United States. A white Southerner from Tennessee is now president. The radical Republicans are horrified, and Andrew Johnson's plan for Reconstruction goes a little bit more lenient than Lincoln's was. He still kind of buys into this idea of 10%, but notice what he also says, that it's up to the state to determine how they're going to handle their policies. He issues pardons to all of these Confederate leaders and military commanders. He restores land to white Confederates. You know, when the Union Army was coming through some of these Confederate areas, especially here in Georgia and South Carolina, many white Southerners abandoned their farms and took off, and the land was confiscated by the Union. So he gives the land back. There had been suggestion by Sherman. One of Sherman's proposals for Reconstruction was to take the Confederate land that had been abandoned and acquired by the Union and redistribute that land. 40 acres and a mule would have been given to each former slave family for them to start their new lives together. So you had Sherman's plan, which was the 40 acres and a mule plan. That was way too lenient for people like Andrew Johnson. He's saying, let's give the land back to the white Southerners who owned it in the first place. And then he firmly believes that the government of the United States and the government of the individual states was a white man's government. He was clearly racist in his plans. So even though he remained loyal to the Union, it wasn't because he was some sort of benevolent abolitionist. No. He was absolutely a racist segregationist. So his plan for Reconstruction is in the extreme, leaning towards a white man's government protecting the interests of the South. Radical Republicans are horrified, but remember their control that they have in the legislature. So where Andrew Johnson vetoes every one of these radical Reconstruction plans that comes before him, they override the veto over and over and over and over again. They begin to override the veto. He's pardoning these Confederate leaders. He's vetoing all of the radical Reconstruction policies, but they override his veto. But allowing the Southern states to kind of go back to their own situation and not really oversee what's happening, the war may be over, but very quickly the South goes back to this previous policies of allowing white men to control the government and restricting African-American opportunities. So even though slavery may have ended, voting rights had not been given to African-Americans. Congress was still in the hands of, was requiring that the Southern states make these provisions to come back and reclaim their seats in Congress. They weren't doing that. They were still just focusing on their state policies. And black codes were established. You need to be very clear about what black codes are. These were state level laws. I'll say that again, state level laws, not national laws, state laws that restricted the freedoms of African Americans and former slaves. So it would be preventing them from owning land, preventing former slaves from voting, preventing former slaves from gaining an education. All of these things were put in place by state law in the South. Another one was known as a vagrancy law. Now think again, we talked before about after the war's over, there's physically a lot of damage to buildings, railroads, roads, general infrastructure that has to be repaired. So vagrancy laws were passed in most of these southern states and towns, and it made it illegal to not have a job. Think about what that's talking about. It's illegal to not have a job. What's the main occupation in the South? It's farming, isn't it? So if a white person, you know, they're not really going to be monitored for these vagrancy laws, but if they were, a white Southerner could say, well, I'm a farmer. Who's going to say anything different? But a former slave in these towns and in these communities, what kinds of jobs would they have had? They don't have any jobs. They don't have any land. They don't have anything to farm. So African Americans were arrested for violating vagrancy laws for not having a job. Look at this image here. Here is prison labor. So guess what jobs they're performing? They are rebuilding the towns, the railroads, the buildings, the roads, the communities that have been destroyed by the Civil War. But it's prison labor, like chain gangs. You see sometimes on the side of the road, you see prisoners who are picking up trash or doing some sort of labor on the sides of the road, whatever. That's what these people are doing. Their whole reason for being arrested is because they don't have a job. So now as prisoners, they're performing labor, but not getting paid for it. So these Southern communities have free labor to rebuild their societies. So again, this is completely inappropriate, the way all of this is being handled in these Southern states. The radical Republican is able to block Andrew Johnson's plan. So his plan for Reconstruction doesn't get put into place because the Congress has enough of a Republican majority to override anything he does. You've got to have 2/3 vote in both houses. Look what we see as a result here. So in these returns, the 1866, so every 2 years you have the election for the House of Representatives, the 64 election, then 66. Look what we see. White Southerners still aren't voting because they're bitter over the Civil War. So the Republicans are going to gain 37 more seats in the House of Representatives. So now they control 77% of the voting population in the Congress. You only need 75% to override a veto. So the radical Republicans have what they need. Andrew Johnson now is essentially powerless. So Johnson gets a little irritated because this is what they pass over his veto. We call this congressional reconstruction or radical reconstruction is what they are going to pass. The Wade Davis bill had been killed under Lincoln's pocket veto. But now that Andrew Johnson is president, and after the election of 1866, giving the Republicans the 77% majority that they need in the Congress to override his veto, they passed the Freedmen's Bureau bill. The Freedmen's Bureau is an organization funded by the federal government of the United States to go in and provide assistance in the South for people who are homeless, people who don't have enough food, to try to get their lives back on track. Initially, the Freedmen's Bureau was intended to help both white and Black Southerners in their rebuilding of their lives. It ends up where white Southerners in many cases didn't trust the Freedmen's Bureau, so it ended up actually helping more African Americans. They built schools. One of the other main problems here is that if African Americans are going to start to work and their main opportunity for work would be farming, but they're going to be farming out based on a contract from the white landowner, you've got to be able to read and understand what the contract is saying that you're signing. You're agreeing to work for certain wages. So basic math and basic reading is essential so that African Americans don't get taken advantage of in these new work contracts that they're going to be signing. So the Freedmen's Bureau provides schools. They bring teachers from the North down to the South to help educate former slaves. So you've got schools, you've got healthcare, medical assistance, you've got legal assistance, all being provided through the Freedmen's Bureau. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is going to be passed. This is going to make sure that rights of African Americans, if they are violated, that this is handled at the federal level. So this is a federal law that makes people who are infringing on the rights of African Americans as citizens, they're going to be providing African American citizenship. And so with the 14th Amendment, citizenship is provided. And so a violation of that becomes a federal matter. And then the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is going to say this is not being monitored very well in the South. There's violence and intimidation that's going on. So the federal government is going to divide the South into 5 military districts. The only state that's met the criteria to come back into the Union is Tennessee. The other 10 Confederate states still haven't made any sort of progress in agreeing to these terms. So each of the districts in the South will be monitored by a Union general, will be the governor of these military districts until those states have met the criteria to come back into the Union. So military reconstruction, this is military oversight. The military is there providing safety and protection to former slaves. They're maintaining order in these communities in the South. They are governing in the South because these Southern states have not met the criteria set by Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction. All right, so here is the Freedmen's Bureau, again, providing assistance. There you can see one of the Freedmen's schools where you've got former slaves of all ages. They're desperate for education. Education becomes really a priority of African-American families during the Reconstruction period. They are desperate for education. Any sort of education opportunity is a priority. And we'll see in a minute that Black colleges are going to be established in the South for higher education. Morehouse is one of those right here in Atlanta that's established during the Reconstruction era. Okay, they're being provided assistance, financial assistance, safety, and then also education, and then housing and all kinds of opportunities through the Freedmen's Bureau. Here's the provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It's, again, providing citizenship. The 14th Amendment is going to ultimately do that because there are some questions about this particular law. And it forbids the states from passing Black codes. So those were those discriminatory laws at the state level. So this is saying you can't do that and give citizenship to anyone born in the United States or immigrating to the United States, regardless of their race or previous condition of servitude, which means whether or not you were a slave, but it does not include Native Americans. So that's also part of the story. Okay, here are the provisions of the 14th Amendment. So these laws, you know, if you've got a different legislature that comes in, that might be changed. So the 14th Amendment also is granting citizenship to former slaves. Look at the wording of the 14th Amendment. So this is the second of our Reconstruction amendments. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge, which means deny, the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. So this is saying once citizenship is granted to these people, the states can't change the definition of citizenship. This is a national priority. This is a national set of criteria, not up to the states. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So white Southerners can't arrest African Americans and deny them their liberties, their freedoms, their property without due process, just cause. Nor can they deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. This phrase, the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, even though we call this a Reconstruction Amendment, it has implications far into the future. Okay, so equal protection. This is going to get into arguments in modern times with the Civil Rights Movement, with voting rights. It's going to get into rights related to women in the workplace. This is going to get into equal protection this gets into gay marriage, gay rights. This is all going to be part of the arguments in the future, is going back to the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, that the state, right, no state shall make a law that abridges, right, violates the privileges or denies any person within its jurisdiction equal protection under the law. So you can't treat people and discriminate based on age, race, gender, whatever, religion. Equal protection has to be maintained within state law. So this 14th Amendment is huge in the future, okay? Military reconstruction, here are the districts. You're going to see that Virginia is the first district. So there's a military commander, a Union general that is controlling the state of Virginia. Same thing here in the 2nd district, the 3rd district, the 4th and the 5th district. So they do not recognize the state governments under the Lincoln and Andrew Johnson plan. So Tennessee is the only one that has actually rejoined the Union and met those standards that were required. So until that happens, these military Union officers will be the head of the state, of the military district. And the voters would have been all male citizens, and to re-enter the state. So regardless of property ownership, all male citizens. What does the 14th Amendment say about citizenship? It says African Americans are citizens. So to re-enter the Union, states have to ensure that African American men who are male citizens of their states have the right to vote, and that the 14th Amendment is ratified. So now your condition for coming back into the Union is ratification of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and guaranteeing African Americans the right to vote. Okay, so how does the South view military reconstruction? They're pretty bitter about it. And many white Southerners say, this isn't part of our government. We're doing our own thing in our own states. And violence and intimidation was beginning to break out, where we start to see the Ku Klux Klan forming. You've got intimidation. Sure, we'll allow African Americans to vote, but we're going to make it very difficult for them to do so. We're going to scare them out of voting. So those issues began to happen, but the military is already there to try to maintain order and protect African Americans. This cartoonist is someone that I really want you to know about. His name is Thomas Nast, and he is probably the most famous political cartoonist ever. And I would be very familiar with his cartoons. He starts to make a name for himself here during the Reconstruction era. But then as we get into the Gilded Age, and you've got big businesses and challenges to the government at that time in the late 1800s, he's also going to take on some of those issues as well. Most of his cartoons appear in this magazine called the Harper's Weekly. It's like a newspaper or a magazine type of publication, very popular. Distribution across the United States, and Thomas, especially in the North, Thomas Nast cartoons are going to appear there. And he is a very strong supporter of Reconstruction and protection of African American rights. And he is very opposed to Andrew Johnson's leniency towards the South. This is one of the early Thomas Nast cartoons. And what I love about his cartoons are the detail and the symbolism and all that's going on. There's a lot happening here. So if we look at this particular cartoon, look at the title, Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction and How It Works. So this is representing Andrew Johnson, and he looks like he's got on kind of like this Shakespearean costume. Well, that's what Andrew Johnson is referencing here, the Shakespeare play Othello. And here's a former African-American soldier from the Union Army who's been injured. He's representing Othello, the hero in the Shakespearean play. And Andrew Johnson, this is representing Lago, who is the villain in the play. And so this is showing how Andrew Johnson is the bad guy in all of this. So these are just some quotes from Andrew Johnson's speeches. That it's problem here. We've got his pardons that he's giving to the Confederate leaders, the rebels in the South. We've got all of his vetoes of the radical Republican policies. We've got the violence up here. This is saying Memphis, and this is saying New Orleans. There were riots that broke out in these two particular states, right? So they're talking about the riots up here, and African Americans are being killed. Like 40 something African Americans are killed in these riots in these two southern places. And white Southerners are responsible for it, but then there's no sort of punishment for it. Then we have down here, Andrew Johnson again, he's a snake charmer. So this is representing, this copperhead snake is representing the South, right? Copperheads are indigenous snakes to the South. And how's he going to be handling and controlling them? Well, he's not going to. He's going to allow them to do their own thing. So this is one of those cartoons that is criticizing Andrew Johnson's policies. Okay, here's another one. And it appears in Harper's Weekly, and it was like the centerfold. So there's actually two different cartoons that are happening together. And we've got this woman sitting here. She looks kind of angelic, but again, look at her head. She's got a star on her head. This is Lady Liberty, or Columbia, as we refer to Lady Liberty. She's sitting here kind of on this throne. We've got the eagle, we've got the American flag here, and we've got all of these men down here below. There's the Confederate flag being laid down. And so we see here, it says pardon. And should I pardon these men? Should I? And she's kind of like, should I be doing this? Should I be giving them a pardon? But then over here, and she says, and not this man. So you've got this African-American soldier, he's lost his leg in the war. And she's saying, should I really not pardon this man, but pardon all of these Confederate leaders? This doesn't make sense. So she's criticizing, Thomas Nast is criticizing the policies that are going to be taking place. Notice over here on the side where you've got kind of like this jar that's enclosed in this box, that's representing the voting box. So the ballots, when people went to vote, you literally put your vote inside of a jar. So this is talking about, you know, we're not allowing the voting rights here. We're not pardoning this man. So is this really something that that should be taking place? Shall I trust these men? Shall I really trust what's happening? All right, Andrew Johnson starts to make things really, really difficult. So as they are overriding his veto, Andrew Johnson gets angry. And remember that when he took over the presidency, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he inherited Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, who were all made up of radical Republicans. And so he starts to fire them one after the other. And the House of Representatives passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. I would write this down because this is what leads to the end of Reconstruction. So this law, the Tenure of Office Act, says that if the President of the United States fires a member of his cabinet who had previously gotten that job by approval from the Senate, then the president can't fire the person without the approval of the Senate. So we've been talking about, and we'll probably hear in the next couple of weeks as we lead into the new administration of Joe Biden, and he's putting together his cabinet. He's appointing different people to different jobs, like Secretary of the Treasury. I think he's already made that appointment now, and Secretary of Defense and all of this. When he makes those choices of who he wants to head those departments, it has to be approved by the Senate. The Senate votes, yes, this person is okay. We agree with this appointment to Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, whatever. So what this law is saying is that the president who makes the appointment and the Senate confirms the choice, if the president fires the person, that firing can't happen unless the Senate approves it. So Andrew Johnson has been firing one after the other of these radical Republicans in his cabinet. And now the Tenure of Office Act is saying you can't do that anymore. Andrew Johnson says, just watch me. So he tries to fire his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who has served throughout the entire war with Abraham Lincoln. And the Senate says, no, we disagree with that. And Andrew Johnson fires him anyway. So Andrew Johnson has now broken a law. So the president can't break a law. So the House of Representatives, we know the process for impeachment. Remember, it's a two-part process. The House of Representatives can vote to impeach the president. But impeachment does not mean that you are automatically removed from office. Impeachment means you're charged with a crime. So the House of Representatives, yes, they vote to impeach the president. They have charged him with a crime. So the second step in the impeachment process is now the vote to whether or not remove the president from office. So we've got the House that votes, the Senate will conduct a trial. So here's a ticket to the Senate trial for the impeachment of Andrew Johnson happening in 1868. By the way, when is the next election going to be held for President of the United States? If Lincoln was elected in 1860, reelected in 1864, the next election's also going to be in 1868. So this is in May of 1868 that they're holding this trial. Can the radical Republicans do pretty much anything they want with Andrew Johnson as president? Sure, because they can override his veto. So when the impeachment process is going forward, they fail to convict Andrew Johnson by one vote. So he gets to keep his job. There were 7 or 8 radical Republicans who voted not to convict him, partially because they thought that there were bigger issues to be dealing with right now than, this transfer of power, because if you remove him from office, they had not replaced him. There was no vice president. At this point, you didn't automatically appoint a new vice president. The job was vacant. So who would become president at this point? Is this something that we want to start dealing with? Is this taking too much power away from the presidency and violating this idea of checks and balances? So there were some radical Republicans even who thought that maybe this was too much of a leap to take the president out of office. So they don't convict him, but the impeachment did occur. Okay, so now we've talked about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. There's going to be another impeachment later on, and then we'll see, in modern times, we've got the impeachment of Donald Trump. None of them were ever removed from office. All right, so here is a cartoon, right? So Andrew Johnson, he's got the Constitution of the United States, and he's kind of teetering on this ladder. He's got this big book, and then it comes down and it crashes on him because, again, they say that he's violated this law. Okay, so the election of 1868 rolls around. Clearly, the Democrats don't want Andrew Johnson as their nominee. They choose the governor of New York, who was Horatio Seymour. And then we've got a war hero, Ulysses S. Grant. General Grant, the hero of the Civil War, is going to be chosen by the Republicans as their candidate. And part of it is, they're saying that the Democrats were not going to hold this hard line. And they're saying who better to hold the line in the successes of the Civil War in defeating the South than the hero of the military. And so we call this where they keep bringing back the emotion of the Civil War. That use of that in politics is known as waving the bloody shirt, right? So they're going to constantly remind voters, remember the horrors of the Civil War, remember all of this destruction and the sacrifice. You need to elect this person because this person has, really committed himself to the cause. And so that phrase, waving the bloody shirt, comes up sometimes, and you'll see that referenced in cartoons as well, when they're politically trying to use the emotion of the war to get their candidate elected. The Democrats are going to attack Ulysses S. Grant personally, and we're going to see that there are some scandals that break out during his presidency. But Grant wins in a landslide. But I want you to look at the breakdown of the votes, okay? So look what we see here. Seymour, of course, he's going to win his home state of New York. But look at the Republican votes. He carries most of the votes here in in the North. But the Republican also wins North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, Alabama, Florida. We're going to see that these southern states are voting Republican. What's odd about that? What do we know that the Republican Party stands for? The Republican Party stands for the party of Lincoln, end of slavery, right? And so how are these southern states voting for the Republican? Or the better question is, who is not voting in these southern states? You have white Southerners who are still bitter over the loss in the Civil War, and they're saying, we're not voting in that presidential election. United States, we're still all about our state not about the nation. And so these white Southerners are refusing to participate in the election. But who is participating and who would be voting Republican in these Southern states? You have African Americans who are voting in these Southern states for the first time. So they're going to vote for the Republican, the party of Lincoln, in many of these states, once they've met that criteria to come back into the Union, which was part of that, the voting rights of, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, some of these states, Virginia has not yet rejoined the Union. Mississippi and Texas have not yet rejoined the Union. They've not met that criteria to come back in. Therefore, they didn't vote in the election of 1868. This election map is going to change dramatically after we get to the end of Reconstruction, which I said was in what year? 1877. So stay tuned. Okay, the 15th Amendment is ratified. This guarantees the right to vote for all people, all citizens, right? Look what it says. The right of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or provision or previous condition of servitude. You can't deny someone the right to vote based on their race. So this cartoon is another Thomas Nast. It's called The First Vote. And you can see that you've got African Americans lined up to vote. So here's a man, probably not very wealthy, probably a poor man, had previously been a slave. This man maybe has a little bit more money. This is a former soldier. So again, they're all voting. So this is called the first vote, representing the 15th Amendment's ratification. So think about 13th Amendment in slavery. 14th Amendment provides citizenship. 15th Amendment provides voting. So 13, 14, and 15, you definitely need to remember. With that voting right, let's look back. Who's not included here? And that would be women. So we've got citizens can't be denied the right to vote based on their race. Doesn't say anything about gender. And the women's movement was highly upset about this. They felt that you've got this amendment that's granting voting rights. You're expanding the right to vote. You could have easily added the word and gender. Can't be denied the right to vote based on race or gender, but it didn't happen. So there gets to where Frederick Douglass and the women's movement have been closely aligned. The abolitionists and the women's movement have been closely aligned. This is going to divide them. So your book has a pretty lengthy discussion of the women's movement and the two organizations that are developed there. I want to save that discussion because I think it fits better when we get into the Gilded Age. So just know that for now, the 15th Amendment did not include women's suffrage. And so this is going to launch a new movement, a new push for women to gain the right to vote. And these women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who'd been part of Seneca Falls, Susan B. Anthony, they're going to kind of lead this new movement to press for women's suffrage. Okay. So let's look at what it means to be freed. We've now got 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and let's see what the reality was in the South. Economically, there's not going to be much equality. And most of the white Southern landowners, if they're going to start making a profit again, they've got to start again producing their cotton. And it's very labor intensive. So the white landowners don't have a labor source. And the labor source, the former slaves, don't have any land. So it would seem as though the two are going to come up with some sort of an arrangement to fulfill the needs of the other, but it's not going to be set up very fairly. So sharecropping is the arrangement that becomes the primary occupation of former slaves. I will say that again. Most former slaves end up becoming sharecroppers. And what sharecropping means is that the landowner will allow the sharecropper a job to work the land, but the sharecropper will be paid in being provided a place to live, the tools to use, the land to work, and the seeds to sow in the land. The sharecropper provides the labor, and then at the end, the sharecropper will turn over most of the crop to the landowner, but keep a portion or a share of the crop for himself. So think about the arrangement. The former slave is providing the labor, and in return, they're getting housing, land to grow their own food, and tools, and a share of the crop. There's not a whole lot that's going to change here. Look at this contract. So this is from a sharecropper's contract that they're going to be signing. So the landowner has the contract, and then the sharecropper is going to be providing the labor, and they're going to make an agreement, a binding, a legal agreement that they're going to be signing. So look what it says. So the planter, right, the landowner controls the crop and the harvest, and the tenant, which is the sharecropper, if any crop is left over, will get that. So the sale of every cropper's part of the cotton to be made by me when and where I choose to sell it. All right, so the sharecropper is going to grow all the cotton. The landowner is going to go and sell it whenever and wherever and for however much he wants to sell it. And after deducting all that the sharecropper, may owe me, right, for the housing or for the food that's being provided or anything that they have borrowed or rented, and all sums that I may be responsible for on their accounts, anything that they've gone and purchased at the store, to pay them their half of the net proceeds. Work of every description, particularly the work on fences and ditches, will be done to my satisfaction and must be done over until I am satisfied that it is done as it should be. So once we sell the cotton crop, however much money we get back, I'm going to then have to deduct what you have borrowed from me and what you have bought on credit at the store. And you also will have to have done this additional work on the property itself, like maintaining the fences and everything else like that. And once that's done, then I'll give you half of what's left over. Guess what? There's not going to be anything left over. There's not going to be a profit. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. These pictures are pictures of sharecroppers. So this man right here, does it look like his life has changed from when he was a slave? No. He's living in extreme poverty. He is stuck in this situation because when it all is said and done, there's no money left. There's no crop left. There's no profit left for him to share in. So he's stuck there. He can't save up money and buy his own land eventually. He is stuck in this arrangement. And in many cases owes the landowner money. Okay. So what we end up seeing, this was a study that was done. It was actually from a farm outside of Athens here in Georgia, a southern plantation in 1860, right at the outbreak of the Civil War, and in 1881. So let's look at this landowner's property. So the landowner's property does not change, okay? The master's house during slavery was right here in yellow. Service and farm buildings right here by the slaves, the owner's house, and then the slave quarters all right there by the owner's house, the master's house, so he can watch what's happening there. When we say gin house, that's a cotton gin. So this is all farmland to grow cotton, and it's being ginned on the property. Civil War is over. All this cotton needs to be grown and harvested. The landowner doesn't have any labor. The former slaves who are now free don't have any work to do. They don't have a job. So look what happens. You now have the landlord's house. You still have the gin house. There's now a school and a church. But notice the difference. The homes of the former slaves are spread out. Why would that be? Because they can. But their jobs really haven't changed. They're still growing cotton. They're still working for the same person. So the only level of freedom and independence that they have is to not be constantly watched by that landowner. But financially, socially, there's no change in their condition and in their lives. Okay. All right. So look at this, this sharecropper cycle. They make this exchange, promises the landowner half the crop. Sharecropper goes and buys the food and the clothing on credit at the landowner's store. Sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. The sharecropper has to give the landowner the crop to sell. The landowner goes and sells it, but the landowner says that the sharecropper actually owes more money than was earned because all of this that he's bought on credit back here in step 2. So to pay the debt, the sharecropper has to promise a greater share of the crop next year. So whatever they've agreed to, if they're going to split it in half this year, then because he's in debt next year, he only gets a quarter of the crop. Guess what? Same thing's going to happen next year. And so these people are stuck. Sharecropping is a terrible, terrible financial situation. Okay. African-American colleges began to develop across the South. These are HCBUs that we talk about, HBCUs that we talk about today in modern time, historically Black colleges. And they're going to be built during Reconstruction. This is part of that Freedmen's Bureau. This is part of that effort to educate African Americans to get out of the sharecropping situation. This is going to be the only option. So Morehouse, probably one of the more famous ones here in Atlanta, was founded in 1867, right during the heart of Reconstruction. So these were the historically Black colleges established during Reconstruction. All of these that are listed in red are constructed during Reconstruction. Black colleges established before the Civil War are in blue. You don't see any in the South. You see a few in the North. All right, so this is a very important part to the Reconstruction story. The Southern states begin to pass state laws that are going to restrict African-American voting. So the voting right says that you can't be denied the right to vote based on your race. But guess what? Southern states now begin to say you have to be literate to vote. You have to show that you can read and write. Look at this Thomas Nast cartoon. So you've got this man over here, this white man dressed as Uncle Sam in this Southern state. And look what he says. He's writing up here. These words just don't look like they make sense. Education, qualification, the Black man ought to be educated before he can vote with us whites. Signed, Mr. Solid South. So does this show that this white Southerner is very educated? No. And so this is saying that the color line still exists. The color line is this racial divide. So we've already established with sharecropping, there's an economic divide between white and Black. Now they're getting around the 15th Amendment by passing state laws that require literacy to be able to vote. So now there's a voting line, a racial line that's existing. So the Southern resentment of the Union League, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Republican Party is all going to develop into these state policies that are enacted, okay? They also, in the South, are going to resent people who've come into the South to help African Americans. Carpetbaggers are the names for people in the North who come to the South for opportunity. A carpetbag was the style of luggage at the time. Here's a picture. This is a carpetbag. It was the luggage, right? This upholstered bag is called a carpetbag. So someone who is using their luggage to come into the South to try to make money, to profit either financially or politically off of what's happening in the South. Are white Southerners voting? Not really. So the Republicans have an opportunity in the South. People in the North who had been trying to get involved into an elected position and were not really seeing much success, some of those people could move to the South and suddenly get themselves elected to office. Some of these entrepreneurs in the North could come to the South and suddenly take advantage of the financial crisis here and the rebuilding of all of the roads and the railroads and the construction and the buildings and all that. To take advantage of that, these white Southerners are calling them as carpetbaggers, opportunists. The way I would like to explain this is a couple of weeks ago when we had the hurricane that came through, a lot of trees were down. To hire tree removal services, those tree removers could charge anything they wanted because people who have a tree through their house are desperate. They just need to have the tree removed so they can raise their prices in this situation. A carpetbagger is someone who is taking advantage of the crisis in the South for their own personal gain, okay? So they, the Southerners are going to view the carpetbaggers in a very, very negative light. A scalawag is someone who these white Southerners are viewing as not coming in from the outside, but opportunists from within the South who begin to see that living in the South, they could take advantage of the situation. They could suddenly become a Republican and get elected to office. So these were terms that these Confederate holdovers, these sympathizers for the Confederate cause in the South, are blaming their neighbors who start to see opportunity to get political control. So a scalawag is a white Southerner who is getting themselves elected, joining the Republican Party, participating in Reconstruction. And it's a negative name that racist white Southerners are using for these people within the South. Carpetbagger is the name that they're using for people coming in from the outside. So this is causing a lot of violence and a lot of conflict in the South. The state level governments in the South are controlled by Republicans because that's all that's voting. These white Southerners who are bitter over the outcome of the war are not wanting to participate. They don't want to join the United States again. So these African-American men start to vote as Republicans and they get themselves elected. White Southern men who are voting are going to, be bitter over this. And they didn't vote. So what we end up seeing is white Southerners not being represented in their state level governments. Look at this picture. This is the South Carolina legislature in the late 1860s and early 1870s. These are the members of the South Carolina legislature, the very legislature who voted to secede when Abraham Lincoln was elected. Look at all of these men. You see a large number of African-American men who have been elected to the South Carolina state legislature, making state laws for South Carolina. The only way this happens is for African-Americans to be voting and white Southerners in South Carolina to not be voting. And so we see that these, and they talk about the radical members, these radical Republicans, these Black South Carolina citizens being elected to office in South Carolina. So we call this radical Reconstruction in the South. This is where we see those state representatives being elected. Some African Americans were actually elected to national offices. Blanche Bruce is an African American man who was elected to the Mississippi delegation to the Senate in 1875. So radical Reconstruction, you have the military still occupying Mississippi. They've rejoined the Union. They're electing their new members to go and serve in the legislature in Washington, D.C. from the state of Mississippi. White Southerners in Mississippi weren't voting. African Americans were in large numbers, and they elect Blanche Bruce, an African American man, to go and serve in the Senate. Okay, so Reconstruction is going to come to an end. So there's a lot of violence that's taking place in the South between these white Southerners who are blaming scalawags and carpetbaggers for their problems. You've got the problems, the economic problems of the sharecropping system, but also what starts to happen by 1873 is an economic recession. So we've talked about the boom and the bust cycle of a capitalist economy. We have a decline in the economy by 1873. So this is an economic panic. You can see the panic here where people are losing their jobs because production has gone down. There's also a problem with the price of cotton, where Great Britain and France had found alternative sources to buy cotton. There's not as much cotton being bought by European nations, and there's more cotton being produced in the South than is being consumed. So the price of cotton plummets. So that's all going to figure into the economic decline in the United States. So one of the problems, right? We've got these businesses that are they've produced more than is being consumed. So they've got to lay off workers. We've got high unemployment. We've got a downturn in the European market as well. Banks are failing. And we go back to the gold standard. So where all of this paper money had been printed to finance the war, we end the paper money and we go back to everything in the gold standard. Gold meaning that there's less money out there. If there's less money out there, then you've got a problem. So we'll talk more about that in class. And one of the main expenses that's draining the federal government's treasury is the Freedmen's Bureau. Think about how expensive that is. So a lot of folks in the North, these are problems with the Northern economy. The Northern economy is failing. And so when the Northern economy is failing, the last thing that Northerners are wanting to do is to help out the South, who they blame for the whole problem in the first place. Ulysses S. Grant is the president, and there is also corruption within his administration. Okay, so this is where there are scandals that break out. A number of the scandals here, you've got members of Congress who had stock in these railroads, and so they're making policies with railroads that benefit them in the Credit Mobilier affair. The whiskey ring, where they're actually skimming money off of the tax revenues that are coming in. So all of this is happening under Grant's watch. Now, there's no indication that Grant himself was participating in the corruption, but Grant's not a politician. Grant is a military man. He's not really a politician, so he wasn't really monitoring what was going on. But on the backs of Ulysses S. Grant running for a potential third term, you've got all these scandals that are mounting. So the election of 1876 gets kind of messy. And the South at that time says, the only way that we're going to be able to get our position of political power back is to start voting again, right? So think about where they have, these white Southerners have lost political power by saying, we lost the war. We're just not going to participate. We're angry that the military's here. We're just not going to participate. They believe that the only way that they're going to gain back their own independence in what they're doing within their state is to start voting again. So this is this counter revolution of the South, where the Black voters had been carrying things for a number of years during Reconstruction. The South is now going to redeem their own political power. So we're going to call these redeemers. These are white Southerners who are going to redeem their political position by beginning to vote again. So what happens is they're going to say, remember, one of the conditions of voting is you had to swear your allegiance to the Union. So finally they say, sure, we're loyal to the United States, but it's going to allow them to vote. And what kind of people are they going to vote into office in state and national positions? They're going to vote in people just like themselves. So they are going to redeem their Southern governments, and the Republican leaders who had been elected to state positions and to national positions are replaced by white Southern Democrats who favor white supremacy. Okay, look at this Thomas Nast cartoon. This one is used a lot. So you've got, this is a white man's government. So they are going to trample on the power of African Americans, right? So here's a Black soldier and he's reaching for the voting box and he's being kept down by white supremacists, Confederate States of America, right? So they've got the Redeemers here that are voting. There are other couple of groups that are voting in large numbers that are out maneuvering the Black voters, and that's also in the North. So it says this is a white man's government. When you see an ape represented here in a cartoon in the 1800s, it's representing Irish immigrants. So I would file that away. Anytime you see the face of like an ape style face in a cartoon from the 1800s, that is representing an Irish immigrant because they viewed Irish immigrants as dirty. So these Irish immigrants are gaining citizenship and they're voting. And so that's taking away the voting power of African Americans. And then here you've also got these businessmen, right? So it says capital up here, these bankers, these businessmen, they're also going to be voting in large numbers to gain power. So all of these groups, the white supremacists, the immigrant voters, the wealthy white elite are voting, and they're all suppressing the Black vote. Okay, so notice what the Democratic platform is now that the whites have redeemed their power in the Democratic Party. We regard the Reconstruction Acts, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of Congress as usurpations and unconstitutional, revolutionary, and void. So the Democrats are saying, we're not going to allow equality to actually occur here. So these are the redeemers. When they redeem their political power, these are white Southern voters redeeming their political power, okay? The Ku Klux Klan is going to form along with the white Citizens League. So these white Citizens Leagues and the Ku Klux Klan are going to use violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans from voting. So sure, according to the 15th Amendment, they may have the right to vote, but they are voting because they want to vote. So if we make them not want to vote because they're scared for their safety and their family's safety, then only white supremacists are going to be voting. So that's going to be the actions taken by the KKK. This is an organization founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest of Tennessee. He was a Confederate veteran who'd participated in the massacre at Fort Pillow, which was this awesome, awful situation that occurred during the Civil War, where there was a Black regiment of Union soldiers that were looking to surrender in this battle at Fort Pillow. And Nathan Bedford Forrest was actually there, and he and the other Confederate soldiers killed them all, rather than taking them as prisoners. So again, the Ku Klux Klan is formed. This is another cartoon. This one's used a lot on the AP exam, representing the intimidation of Black voters. So notice what it says, the Union as it was, this is a white man's government. The lost cause. The lost cause is kind of this Confederate nostalgia where these whites after the Civil War are trying to bring back their white power, their white supremacy. And this is saying worse than slavery. So here you've got this family that is, being intimidated. You've got hanging. You've got the schoolhouse that's up in flames. These Freedmen Bureau schools are going to be challenged. And so it's scary, the White Citizens League and the KKK working together. The federal government's going to try to get control of the situation. So they pass enforcement laws, and it makes it a federal offense to interfere with voting through bribery and intimidation. Well, who's going to enforce this? That's the military occupation. The Union Army, the United States Army, is still occupying many of these southern states to try to make sure that the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens League don't carry out their mission of violence and intimidation. So this was military intervention to protect the Reconstruction laws. So you've kind of got a standoff here where African Americans are being protected by the United States military in southern states that are gradually becoming more politically controlled by white southern redeemers and the violence of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Supreme Court is going to end up hearing a couple of cases. So in 1873, we're going to see what are known as the slaughterhouse cases. This is a number of cases that are trying to interpret the 14th Amendment, what they are talking about with citizenship. And what ends up coming out of the slaughterhouse cases is that it weakens the Civil Rights Act, and the 13th and 14th Amendment that had guaranteed citizenship. The slaughterhouse cases make a distinction between national and state citizenship. You can be a citizen of the United States if you're African American, but your citizenship within your state is determined by your state government. So it gave the state governments the ability to pass state level laws that may restrict what it means to be a citizen within that state. So this is not good for African American equality and African American safety. One of the cases in particular is this one, US versus Cruikshank. And I would make note of this. And there was a massacre that took place in Louisiana where a group of African Americans had gotten together and they were working out a plan for political action within their community in Louisiana. And these white supremacists showed up and killed them all. And so these white supremacists who had murdered these African American citizens of Louisiana were not prosecuted. There was no accountability. They weren't held for murder of citizens. And the case goes to the Supreme Court, the case US versus Cruikshank. And look at the ruling here. The Supreme Court said that the 14th Amendment that guarantees the federal government's protection of civil rights only exists in cases involving discrimination by the state. Think about what that means. The murder of these African Americans in the state of Louisiana was not prosecuted. It was not holding anybody responsible for their murder. And the Supreme Court says that's actually appropriate because the 14th Amendment protecting civil rights, it's only against abuse by the government. So if the state of Louisiana, if the police force had come in, or the militia of Louisiana had come in and murdered these African Americans, in that case, the federal government could step in and prosecute because the government was discriminating against these African Americans. But because the murder of these African Americans in Louisiana had happened at the hands of other citizens of Louisiana, the court case US versus Cruikshank says this is a state matter among the people of Louisiana, and therefore it should be a Louisiana case. Who makes up the jury of courts in Louisiana? White Louisiana citizens. Are they ever going to prosecute other white citizens of Louisiana for murdering African Americans? No. So this court ruling was a terrible day for African Americans because this said that the only protection that they have is from government abuse, not from the violence of other members or citizens of their state. So discrimination of individuals by individuals or by groups of individuals in a state is not protected by the 14th Amendment. This was a terrible ruling for African American safety. Okay. Then the election of 1866 or 1876 is going to be the end of Reconstruction. All right, now follow what I'm saying here. We've got Reconstruction that has started at the end of the war in 1865. We've got the amendments that have been passed. We've got the civil rights that's been passed. We've got all of this, the Freedmen's Bureau that's come in to try to protect and provide security and education for African Americans. We've got military reconstruction. All of that's been in place, but it comes to an end right here in this election of 1876. So the Republicans, after all the scandals of Ulysses S. Grant's campaign, the Republicans are going to choose Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio to be their candidate, and the Democrats are going to choose another New Yorker, Samuel Tilden. And it is an incredibly close election because remember now some of the Redeemers are beginning to vote in an election. They're not going to vote Republican, they're voting Democrat. So in these southern states of Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, the votes are incredibly close, too close to call. And so they demand a recount. Sound familiar? So they start demanding recounts, and the Electoral College meets, and you have two sets of votes that have been submitted from these southern states, each claiming to be the right number of votes. So to resolve it, we end up, these three states, you'll see in the eventual decision, these three states end up going Republican, and you'll see why. But notice that the electoral vote is decided by one vote. Look at how close the popular vote is. All right, so these three states ultimately determine the outcome of the election. If they go Democratic, Samuel Tilden is your president. And again, notice how regionally divided this is. All of the southern states are voting Democratic now because they have redeemed their vote. These white voters are now once again voting. They've also done so in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. But look what happens. When this is disputed, there is a compromise that is going to happen. So a committee is formed of 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 3 judges from the Supreme Court to determine which set of voting numbers from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. From South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, a committee is formed to determine which set of votes to go with, the one that favors the Democrat, the one that favors the Republican. And the only way that they determined to make this fair was to have 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 3 judges to make this decision. And they come up with a compromise to agree to which votes to use. The southern states will agree to go with the Republican votes in their states, which will allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become the president. And in return, look what they get. Military occupation of the southern states is over. There will be no more military reconstruction. The Union Army is out. The United States Army is out. What does that mean for the protection of African Americans' safety? It's over. What does that mean for overseeing elections? It's over. They also agree that key cabinet positions within Rutherford B. Hayes' administration will be given to Southerners. They also agree that the federal government is going to give the South cash to rebuild their railroads. Reconstruction's over. We've already got the case Cruikshank versus the United States, which says that in cases of violence and intimidation between individuals within a state, that is a state matter that the federal government's not involved in. So Reconstruction ends with this compromise of 1877, which is the outcome of the election of 1876. So in your vocabulary list, you need to connect those 2 things. The election that's disputed is what creates the compromise of 1877, which ends Reconstruction. And from this point on, 1877 onward, okay, so the next presidential election is going to be in 1880. So from 1880 on, you're going to see the southern states, every one of these southern states will vote Democratic from 1880 all the way through the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So you're going to start asking me, when does this stop? Because we're going to be looking at these election maps, and every one we're going to talk about the solid South, solidly voting Democratic, no Republican electoral success in the South until we get to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So Reconstruction is over. So notice we've got this cartoon here, right? To a truce or not, a compromise, but a chance for high-toned gentlemen to retire gracefully from their civil declarations of war. So again, Tilden or blood, right? Tilden is the Democrat. So we're either going to go with Samuel Tilden or there's going to be blood. We're going to fight over this. And so the compromise of 1876 puts down the guns, puts down the violence, and allows the Republican, notice here that it's well-dressed, got kind of the cufflinks here, representing kind of the upper class, the financial interest of the Republican Party in the North, that will be allowed to take control. So this cartoon is representing the end of Reconstruction and Rutherford B. Hayes becoming the president of the United States instead of Samuel Tilden, who was the Democrat from the South. So here's the question. Was Reconstruction successful or was it a failure? This can be and has been used as an LEQ question, a long essay question many times before. Could you have examples of success? What could we say is successful about Reconstruction? Well, let's back up. It's easier to talk about the failures. What would be a failure of Reconstruction? Certainly, it's going to be the protection of African-American rights. That's certainly a failure. The economic rights and success and opportunities for African-Americans, failure. The protection of safety for African Americans, failure. What could we list as a success? We're going to see successes in educational opportunities. Give me an example of that. You're going to see Freedmen's Bureau schools. You're going to see the rise of colleges for African Americans in the South, Morehouse being an example. Successes that you could see would be voting rights, political rights, with the Reconstruction Amendments 13, 14, and 15, guarantees citizenship and voting rights and end of slavery. So those are successes. Now, are they maintained? Probably not. You could see early examples of success when you've got the many of those southern states electing African-American representation. South Carolina legislature, Blanche Bruce from Mississippi, that would be an example of a success of early political equality. But then the failure is going to come later, and the failure is going to be a lack of equality, a lack of maintaining control of these violent redeemers and Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist organizations. All right, so there is the end of Unit 5. We've done a lot. We've talked about the lead up to the Civil War. We've talked about the war itself. And now we've talked about Reconstruction. So until next time, keep reading and go make history.